Yes, Ms. Graham.
Thank you. We were looking at your action book just before lunch, and just to explain, I'm interested in helping the chair understand when this was prepared and how it was prepared by you. And I've asked you about the 1400 hours, the first entry, and if we have that on the screen again. And I think you've explained already that this is prepared in retrospect.
Yes.
Right. And is this prepared from your memory of events?
Yes, supported by the information that I had to hand at that time when populating it.
So other documents that you may have, things such as your daybook, entries in that. I think yesterday you talked about taking things from the daybook and putting them into the action books.
That's correct.
And looking at this page, could you explain to the chair what he can see here in the action book? We see on the left-hand side numbers, and I think they move from 1 upwards.
That's correct.
In order. And then there's an action listed. But can you explain the remainder of the pages, please?
And probably more importantly, I would say, is that in the numerical order within that should be the time and date that the action was created.
All right.
Whether I was consciously aware of that and the fact that it was 1400 that I'd started populating for the majority of actions, because actually on the last page I do time and date the action and when the handover was.
Let's look at the last page then. So this whole document's been prepared by you?
Yeah, effectively between 1400 hours on the 3rd to when I handed it over to 20 hours on the 4th to the Met officers.
And we see on this final page in the left-hand column there is a time, 12:20.
Yeah.
So that's not a numerical number in terms of the order.
No, that's the time that I basically concluded my involvement with the action book and handed it over.
So it was started on the 3rd and continued until 12:20 on the 4th?
Yeah.
And was this on a rolling basis? You would continue entering?
Yeah, and as I say, it would be more, I suppose I knew it to myself, but it would certainly have been helpful to know, not so much with the original actions, but the time and date that I'd created the action, because it's, obviously there is a space for it.
So on the 4th of May, you then handed this over to, you say, a DS Moore. But let's go back to the first entry and just, you can explain to the chair what he can see in this book.
So for fullness and how it should probably have been depicted was, so action 101 should have contained 1400 on the 3rd of the 5th, because that's when I created it. It was obtain a copy of the call card, so that's the specific action. The origin source is where has the reason for this action come from, SIO, so that was from me. Who did I allocate it to? Me, because I was in possession of the call card. It then went into the file at 2 o'clock because it was the time that I put it into the file.
Right. And so it says you were allocated the task, D.I. Robson. That's when you completed that task, 1400 hours that day, and the resultant document was put in the file.
And the numerical number of that document, so I think there, whether I don't even call that my writing, but it's that document 6 in the faded writing, the document summary.
So in the right-hand column it says D6. We can see another one, D7, just below that.
And you would normally have populate a file for documents and populate a file for statements. So any action, if it's resulted, you would know what the corresponding reference number is.
So the call card is a document. It's put in the document section of a file, and that would have been the 6th document in the file.
Yes.
And then we'll see that there are diagonal lines through number 1, number 2, number 3. But as we get towards the end of your action book, those diagonal lines don't appear. Can you explain what the significance is?
I don't think there's any guidance around it. That's probably for my benefit, and because obviously the multiple number of actions in terms of when you're going back through them to see what is completed and what is not. It's clear when you open the page with the score across. For my benefit, being in charge of the action book at that time, that would be a completed action.
And then just, can we look at, I have it as page 9, it's action number 12. And this says, carry out inquiries in an effort to identify deceased male, allocated by the SIO, to DS Davidson and DC Connell. And is that what you talked about earlier about DS Davidson and DC Connell going to Victoria Hospital to try to identify?
Yeah, so obviously DC Connell was already there. I think DS Davidson had come back. We discussed the options to try and identify Mr. Bio. I think we'd considered and I prepared the police systems because there was an existing image on police systems. I think it was the age of that in terms of the likeness of what was the current likeness, and I think that what was found on Facebook give a most current likeness of his appearance.
And so when we look at this now, do we see that under 12 it would have been helpful to see a time of when that action was created? That's not there. But then we can see where the time that the action has been completed, and that says 1800 hours.
Yeah, and the completion is normally administrative completion, is when, as opposed to then you'll see in the document summary that the context of that is that was carried out at 11 o'clock.
So is there anything in this action book that suggests you want to change your evidence from earlier about DS Davidson going to Victoria Hospital at round about 11 in the morning?
No.
And it says there, 11 o'clock, 3/5/15, Facebook image of deceased. Does it say compared at hospital?
Yes.
And visual ID confirmed? And so is that a note by you about the actions that were taken by DS Davidson? And can I look at page 10, which is strategy 14, action 14, I should say. This says, establish interview strategy for officers involved in incident with regards to
Noting of statements.
noting of statements. Tell us about that.
So again,
action.
it was a task that needed to be considered and carried out, though I was the origin because it's something that I identified needed to take place, and in terms of allocated to, maybe should have distinguished the SIO at that time. I was probably looking towards Detective Superintendent Campbell in conjunction with the PERC.
So thought of by you as SIO, but then passed on to
Yeah.
Detective Superintendent Campbell.
That's correct.
And we see some lettering in the right-hand side there, handwriting. Can you tell us what
Yes,
that
that's
means?
that's not my writing. So again, whether that was, I'm assuming if that was put onto the original document, whether that's corresponding, so that whether that's, it looks like A10 and A17, some cross-reference to another action book, whether that was, I don't know if the Holmes was used or PERC had their own action book. I'm not
But
sure.
this was on the 5th of May. Is that the time? The time seems to be...
So there's a fourth. So it's not my writing, and that's obviously been entered onto the action book once I've handed it over to the MIT. So whether that's the MIT's writing in terms of corresponding actions from a resultant action log they created, or PERC, I don't know.
Thank you. And then action 18 on page 11. You can see there, TST Colette Bell.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
So trace and take statement is what TST stands for.
And you've given a link there to a Police Scotland reference number.
So that would probably be would be the call card number that was raised following her call to police.
And then what do you write underneath that?
So I've reiterated the link to where the origin of my action has come from. Reported concern for boyfriend Sheku Bio, born 30/09/83, disturbance at her address, and had received a call from a friend stating he had been assaulted by Bio.
And this is allocated to DC Parker and DC Mitchell.
Yes, and in knowledge at that time that they had engaged with Colette, yes.
And that would have been via DS Dursley.
Yes.
And then you note in the right-hand column, 10:45 on the 3rd of May, informed of circumstances.
So yeah, there is the statement as the action pertains to was resulted at 18:30, and then the additional context is because as part of that statement, I think that was the death message.
Can I ask you about action 30, please? Can you read out what we see here?
Identify intelligence cell to carry out checks profile of all parties involved.
And that's the origin of that is SIO, and then it says in terms of who it's allocated to, what does that say?
So that's 5DIO, which was the Divisional Intelligence Office. It's our intelligence function for the division.
And then it says in the right-hand column, what?
Intel profiles created for Colette Bell and Sheku Bio.
Tell us about this entry, please.
So at the time that I'm in control of the action, I have asked for checks, background checks, to be carried out for all parties involved. Probably in terms of the civilian element as opposed to the police, to help build that picture, background to the events. At the time that I've handed it over, I have only been in possession of profiles for Colette Bell and Sheku Bio.
And what was the purpose of actioning intelligence cells?
So
carry
again,
out
it's a function to support an investigation in terms of what information do we hold on police systems to support the investigation.
And how would information about Colette Bell help support the investigation?
I suppose until we've done the checks, we wouldn't know in terms of background, and it's a variety of systems. Not what we're just looking to. It's not to criminalise the fact that she'd been involved in the police. We've just got access to a number of our own systems and partner systems that would just help build that information picture.
So, building a picture of information.
Another source of information. Until we'd carried that out, we wouldn't know of any relevance of what to discount or potentially include as part of the investigation.
Is that customarily done in relation to partners of people who've died?
It's everybody.
Everybody.
Yeah.
And so, although you've only mentioned Colette Bell and Sheku Bio there, would those checks have been carried out on all the witnesses?
That would be my expectation, yes.
And then, in relation to Sheku Bio, is it something that's customarily done if someone has deceased, has
So
died?
again, all parties.
And then, can we look at action 34, please? Could you read out this action?
34, did you say, sorry?
34,
Four.
yes.
Arrange formal identification of deceased by next of kin or appropriate family member associate.
And when it says the origin of that is SIO, was that yourself?
Yes.
And that was allocated to, it says SIO PERC there.
So again, that would have been done in conjunction with Detective Superintendent Pat Campbell as part of the handover to PERC.
Was it your expectation at the time you completed this entry that there would be a formal identification of Mr. Bio by his next of kin?
Not necessarily having been completed, but arrangements, or certainly that action explored, again, because of the death, in terms of the primacy with Procurator Fiscal, maybe in conjunction with them.
Can I ask you about action 44, please? And it says Procurator Fiscal to be notified regarding death. And the result is 1200 4 May 2015. How reliable are the timings in relation to that?
So they're reliable in terms of the time that I've resulted the action. Again, probably what it's not indicative of when it was carried out.
We may hear that the fiscals were notified
I
on
would
the
ex-
3rd of May.
I would expect during the morning of the 3rd, definitely.
So if the chair is considering this document at a later stage, he should bear that in mind when he's reading the results, timings.
And I would expect to be contained within someone's statement who picked up the phone to whether it was the on-call to start with and resulted, obviously you referenced Mr Green.
So individual statements from witnesses, and we may hear indeed from Mr David Green that those statements will probably be more accurate in terms of timings of when things were done.
That's correct.
Thank you. Thank you. I said, I'll move on from the action book. I said I would like to ask you some questions about the death messages. And I'd like to begin with the death message that was relayed to Colette Bell, first of all. So this is in the morning on the 3rd of May when she's in Kirkcaldy Police Office.
That's correct.
We've heard evidence from Mitchell and Parker about that, and also from DS Dursley. And I'd like to ask you if you recollect the conversation you had with DS Dursley about delivery of that death message to Colette Bell.
I don't specifically recall the full content of the conversation, but I definitely recall the resultant action of the agreement of what we were going to do.
And we've heard from DS Dursley about this discussion that you had, and we've looked at his daybook. Did you see any of DS Dursley's evidence or watch any of his evidence?
Really only what played out in the media as a result.
Right. So just to recap on his evidence regarding his daybook, he had an entry within that where he had noted that Colette Bell was to be given a death message. And the words he noted down from your conversation were black male dead. And then I asked him about certain phrases and words and descriptions of that death message that arose in subsequent statements that he'd prepared the next day and in June, so a month later. Do you remember what words were used by you during the conversation you had with DS Dursley?
No, I don't. It was just the overriding a sense or purpose that she needed. Having engaged her earlier with the call that she'd made and officers attended, for her to be brought back to the police station, for us then to learn that Mr Byard had died. It was just the kind of universal agreement that Colette Bell needed to know that he died.
Is there anything at all in your daybook that would help you recall the words that were used?
I don't think so, and again, unlike I know the former words that potentially do form part of the later notification, it's not something that we sat and deliberated for any great length of time. We'd obviously tasked officers with the main purpose of contacting her as part of that information gathering. It just seemed the right moral thing to do at that time, not appreciating the impact as a result of what we did.
And was there anywhere that the wording of that message was noted down?
No.
Is that normal practice to not note those down?
Not when providing a form of words, which I haven't really have no previous experience of.
Did you have previous experience of delivering death messages
Regularly,
prior to
yes.
3rd of May? Had you ever noted them in your notebook, for example?
The time and date of the notification, yes. As to any conversation or context, no.
No. Is there anything at all in your action book that would help you have any recollection of that conversation you had with DS Dursley?
I think it just tells you in the action about Trace taking a statement from Colette in terms of the time that we told about. It says there about informed of the circumstances, whereas we didn't inform of the circumstances, but informed them of the death.
You make a distinction there. Can you explain what that
Well,
is?
it's just been, you've just brought it to my attention in terms of I've noted a time that we have told her, informed her of the circumstances, which is factually incorrect.
Was there any discussion between you and DS Dursley about the extent to which you should explain to Colette Bell what had happened?
No, I think his overriding factor was to tell her that he died. There would be conversation, and I don't think it definitely on the face of it looks quite cold and calculated to ask our DCs to go in and say, following report concerns for Sheku Bayou, he's died, without providing some form of wraparound in that. Appreciating that I had never met Colette Bell, we have to have kind of trust and confidence in our officers with the skills and experience that they've got to go in and manage that conversation, and during that deliver and be quite specific, because if we go in with a conversation and they miss the death message, so it has to be quite pointed that to reinforce the fact that he's died. Because again, lessons learned when we've went in conversational, they have maybe missed that and not been clear that the person involved had died.
Do you remember any part of the conversation where it was agreed that the circumstances, insofar as it related to police contact, would not be shared with Colette Bell?
Not in as far as specific to the police contact, any of the details, because by not telling her about the police contact, we've been consistent by telling her nothing else as well, in terms of even the details of what led police, the calls that led police to go to Hayfield Road that day.
We've heard from Mitchell and Parker that this is not a pleasant job for officers to do. Did you anticipate that there would be difficulties with delivering a death message to Colette Bell if the information was so limited that you were simply telling her her partner may have died?
By telling them only to go and deliver the death message is, I suppose, less difficult in terms of the messaging, but the difficulty thereafter is the response and the questions that no doubt they'll have posed and been faced with as a result of just introducing the fact that he died. So it seems quite remiss that we've not discussed what to tell her, and we've not told her very much.
You feel that you were remiss in that?
Yeah, because it just smacks of being like quite cold and calculated, not the way it was intended. Also, that process over people as well, in terms of the person it was impacting. I've obviously went through the kind of strands of the investigation and like that checklist, and it was at that time with the pace of it and the other things that was going on, I think I've made the decision and I stick by it was the right thing to do, but maybe not then given further thought of what are we actually telling her. Again, relying on the skills and experience of the officers to potentially talk about the generic processes in terms of death investigations, not involving the police in terms of process as opposed to the physical involvement of the police that this related to.
Can I ask you to look at your second inquiry statement, SPPI 251, and paragraph 172. And we've got that on the screen. I've been told that DS Graham Dursley states the following: whilst I did think it was Sheku Bayou who was dead at that time, there was no formal identification. So between me and Colin Robson, we delegated Wayne Parker to tell Colette Bell words to the effect that a black male had been found dead and we suspected that it may be her partner. We based this on the fact there was a black male dead and that a gold-coloured mobile phone was found at the locus. The wording of the death message is not recorded anywhere in any format. And then at 173 you say, yes, I agree with that. Recording the wording is irrelevant as long as she's told and it is documented, the statement. So you see the words in quotation marks there. A black male has been found dead and we suspected that it may be her partner, end quotation. Is that your recollection of the message that was to be delivered to Colette Bell?
So again, and the point of having this element noted from maybe the inquiry team, it was, do I concur that the words to that effect were used? Because obviously they were introduced by DS Dursley. That was, accurate. I didn't, because the words he used, I didn't Yeah, I didn't fall out with that or challenge it, knowing the focus of, well, certainly one word in that paragraph.
So you're aware that we've had discussion, we've taken the evidence of D.S. Dursley in relation to the words found dead.
Yeah. And again, if it was a conscious effort at the time to try and hide the police involvement, then that's probably something that I thought I would have picked up on. But I think was this the general terms of what we were telling her? Yes. Appreciating the kind of, and by no means the play on words, but the interpretation and what the perception around that one word and how that changes that image. If those words were to say to someone the image that they would potentially portray in their mind.
So the words found dead, you're aware of the evidence regarding that because you've seen some of D.S. Dursley's evidence already. And you'll then understand that we've heard evidence from Colette Bell that she understood he'd been found dead and had perhaps been murdered and then found subsequently dead. You'll also know that I asked a number of questions of D.S. Dursley about the lack of information given to Colette Bell about police contact.
I'm not sure I saw that. I just more effectively the headlines of that word.
Do you know why there would have been why there was a decision taken not to tell her about police contact?
I don't, and to be honest, I've given evidence that, the transfer of that senior investigating officer oversight, that decision sat with me, and I think we were without any consultation, that we were comfortable that, and my words is that she needs to know he's died, would be my interpretation or my view of what we were telling her. Tell him that Sheikh Ubaya has died, but without giving her context around it, and that's what I still really struggle with. And as I say, I've worked with D.S. Dursley for a number of years, and we are kind of have been our biggest critics around this, is that taking away the contact element of the police, if there was no police involvement, we would be going to Colette Bell and telling her pretty much the details of, well, her concerns related to a call that we had just attended, potentially, and just that chronology of taken to hospital, and I'm sorry to say now he's died. That certainly gives the accuracy around it and a better picture. Don't get me wrong, in terms of I wouldn't be able to account for her reaction, because there would be questions as a result, but we do this on a daily basis, and we've...
Why would you not wish to tell Colette Bell that he'd died after police contact? He was alive when the police arrived at Hayfield Road. He subsequently died after police contact. You'll understand it.
I definitely do, and whether, again, I talked about the second guessing and my judgments of, was I allowed to say that? Was it my position to say that, knowing the involvement of Park? I don't know. But it was by introducing it without providing some form of context or detail.
Was there an attempt to hide the fact that there'd been police contact?
Absolutely not, and why would it be when it was so public facing? So, and if it was an attempt, it would soon very quickly be found out, and there was no. This wasn't a discussion to try and how do we get round this and hide the police involvement. The discussion, as difficult it might be for people to see, was trying to do the best thing. We were very accustomed to the process, and this is where I talked about the process maybe got us instead of considering the people that affected it, and I've seen the impact. It's bad enough telling somebody they've died, and I suppose we can't stop the trauma involved in that, but if we add to that for the manner we've done it, that's what doesn't sit well with me, and which I've struggled with.
Why would it be doing the best thing to not tell Colette Bell that there'd been police contact?
So it seemed the right thing to do, and tell her as soon as we had been notified he'd died. Colette had reported concerns. We were satisfied round about the identification. there was the kind of collective thing with me and Dave Stursley, she needs to know. What bothers me is the lack of then us sitting down and carefully considering, well, what are we telling her? So we tell her, but don't tell her much more, and the agony that has caused, which I've seen. I suppose, thinking in retrospect, if I'd not told her, and maybe sought clarity of what we're going to tell her, then does that leave us open to further criticism of delaying that? So definitely kind of moral kind of quandary. We did it. I think we did it for the right reasons, but we definitely didn't deliver the service that we should as part of that.
So looking back now, what information would you have provided to Colette Bell? If you were looking back now,
I would have provided the same update that I'd provided to senior management, in effect, potentially tailoring it to suit, obviously telling a member of the public that she'd called the police about concerns. We would have told her that prior to her phoning there'd been a call by a number of members of the public. I don't even know I have to go on about the bit of the knife, whether it's concerned, again, just maybe generalising. Police have attended, had contact, Mr. Bow. He's become unresponsive, unconscious, he's been conveyed to hospital and he's died. To then, I suppose that then speaking with confidence in what I know now in terms of the process that would ensue, in terms of as a result of death following police contact, and with confidence with this was what is going to happen. I wasn't aware of that at the time.
And if you had been delivering a message with more information, which is what you're describing, would you also have mentioned, or could you also have mentioned, that police were trying to arrest him, trying to restrain him, and then he became unconscious?
At that time, probably not, because again, I'm introducing stuff and we have very conscious if I'm introducing information that I don't know to be factually correct. So I have had circumstances previously, and this was by no means telling Colette very little from a lessons learned, but I have had times that stuff had been played back to us that's found to be factually incorrect. So there is a balance in terms of doing the right thing, which is all good and well, but then to go and deliver it in a fashion that's caused further trauma is not acceptable.
Now, a moment ago, I have you noticed saying you weren't allowed to say, you used the phrase not allowed to say about police contact, and I just want to ask you, why would you not have been allowed to mention police contact?
My lack of understanding of the processes. That by no means was that an instruction or any suggestion that during your inquiry or your actions don't mention the police involvement. But by not mentioning, we were consistent because we told her nothing. We didn't introduce the fact that the calls with the knife and then failed to mention the police. We told her nothing, but again, that was, yeah.
And did that decision to tell her as little as that have anything to do with the situation with Perk?
Definitely played on my mind of what was I allowed to say. I didn't see clarity either, and I wasn't given instruction, but she needed to know as soon as practically possible. And I think with the full intention that we would support it, we would be back to tell her very quickly more. So it wasn't as a introducing the death and then just silence from it was aimed at me then potentially liaising with senior management to notify them of the informed Colette Bell of the death, to then go back potentially with the formal words or circumstances.
When you say that you knew you think you'd be back very quickly, we know from your earlier evidence this morning that you were aware that there was to be a stop put on it effectively by Perk, who were going to come in and take over. So by the time Colette Bell's come back to Kirkcaldy Police Office in about 10:45, is it correct to say that you thought you'd be back very quickly, knowing at the same time that Perk were going to take over and put a stop on your actions?
Yeah, I think, as I say, so we're never told not to tell Colette Bell that he died. Myself and D.S. Dursley made that decision. It seemed the right thing to do. I've then obviously went to that update to the Goal Group, whether I was hoping for some form of clarity, guidance from there to go back and supplement the information.
So you thought that you would be going back to collect bail at some stage after the first Gold Group meeting?
Yeah, because our involvement with her had definitely not ended. I mean, it was going to be an ongoing element, appreciating that the information we were still looking to get from her as part of that information gathering.
Can I move on and ask you about the death message that was delivered to Caddy Johnson and her family? Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the evidence we've heard so far is that your involvement was in relation to the first death message that was delivered to the Johnsons.
I wasn't involved in that.
You weren't involved. Were you involved in a discussion about delivering the death message to the Johnsons?
So the discussion was during the Gold strategy, or the Gold Group, sorry, in terms of that next to kin contact with the view or instruction from Park that it was to be the first contact with the Johnson family was going to be family liaison officers. Again, I think that's when I explained my kind of frustration that it was going to take time to do that.
We've heard some evidence that the officers Mitchell and Parker attended initially at the Johnsons' house to deliver the first death message, and the position was very similar at that stage to the one that had been delivered to collect bail. But they then returned for a second visit at a later stage, and the evidence we heard from DS Dursley was that he'd been in direct contact with Detective Superintendent Campbell about the second death message. But as I understood it, that was only in relation to the second death message, not the first.
Yeah.
So do you remember having any discussions with DS Dursley about the first death message that was delivered?
No, because again, my role in terms of from going into that first Gold Group as the SIO, handing over to Detective Superintendent Pat Campbell, who became the SIO. So when that Gold Group ended, he had assumed obviously investigative oversight. My role was, not saying purely administrative, but I think I explained about doing the summary for the Gold Group, again to help aid Park when they arrived, and also the administrative terms of committing to paper in terms of recording our actions, and that was the action book. I was definitely aware later about the form of words, and I know through just speaking, I think it was DS Dursley in terms of his views around that, but never in, as he was effectively being direct tasked by the SIO who had changed at that point.
Can we look at paragraph 180 of your inquiry statement, please? And it should say, I have been told Dursley stated to the inquiry. Oh, sorry, I thought we were on the second inquiry statement. That's my fault. 180. I've been told Graham Dursley stated to the inquiry that I was involved in this. I wasn't supplied the form of words. It's accurate that I was the point of contact for senior management. I wasn't involved in the form, the words. I don't know who did. I didn't task Graham Dursley to give the form of words. We were all in Kirkcaldy Police Station. It certainly wasn't me. I appreciate the delay is a significant element to how this is playing out in the public. I'm not trying to shy away from that. Even in the Gold Group, there were discussions of management going to meet the family. In the early stages, that's not practical, and think that happened later. So, does this, insofar as you're referring to death messages delivered to the Johnsons, is your position that you had no involvement in the wording for any of the death messages that were delivered to the Johnsons?
So we didn't supply a form of words to collect bail, and I wasn't involved in the messages to the family, either the initial contact and then the follow up with the form of words.
All right. And we may also have heard evidence that at some point in a Gold Group meeting, to give some context here, DS Dursley talked about his concerns about the delay in giving more information to the family. And he was concerned about wishing to be in a position to provide more information to the Johnsons in a second death message. And as part of that, he was, as I understand it, in touch with you when you were at a Gold Group meeting, and you asked Pat Campbell to come out of that meeting to discuss the wording of a death message. Now, this is in his statement. Do you remember being asked to leave or come out of a meeting with Pat Campbell to talk about the death message for the Johnsons?
I don't recall, but I do remember, and credit to DS Dursley in terms of his persistence round about this issue.
But you don't remember any involvement at all?
No, and again, I may have been in the room, but again with the responsibilities that had then been given and the kind of time pressures about the next meeting, that I may have been there, but not tuned into it.
So if any evidence we've heard from witnesses recollects you being involved in any way with these death messages, would that be incorrect?
As I say, I may have been present. I didn't pore over the words or review the words or contribute to the words given, no.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you now about some of the briefings that you gave to Pat Campbell. Can I ask you to look at paragraphs 188 to 189? And this is information that was given to Pat Campbell, and you were asked and referred to a statement, PERC statement by Detective Superintendent Campbell, which stated, "I have been informed that within these notes DSI Harrower," that's someone from PERC, "has recorded having a conversation with myself at 10:22 hours and that I said, in quotations, male ran towards officer with a knife, end quotations. I recall stating that to DSI Harrower. Colin Robson was the on-call detective inspector that day, and he provided me with numerous updates. It was Colin Robson who mentioned during one of the updates that Shekubayo had run towards the officers with a knife." And that again is in quotations. So that's a quote from Pat Campbell's statement, a PERC statement. And your reply at 189 is, "I don't recall specifics, but it's quite plausible that from the information I had was that he had run towards officers with a knife. When I talked about engaged a male, if I said ran towards officers with a knife, that's because I've been told it or my understanding from what I've picked up. That's entirely plausible. I don't recall saying it though." But you may not recall that conversation with Pat Campbell, but I think you've already said today that you did provide him with numerous updates that morning.
And I verbally, yeah.
And you seem to be saying here that it's plausible, so you could have said that. I'm interested in where you would have got the information that Shekubayo had ran towards the officers with a knife.
So I was never told directly that by anybody, if I recall. So again, maybe by probably round about that 7:46 was the first phone call, in terms of 45 minutes into the incident, that I've relayed the circumstances of the numerous calls of the male with the knife. If I've then the kind of leap of faith or assumption that that's what's happened, they've engaged, again, without the versions from the officers, I couldn't say.
Can I ask you to look at PERC 223, please? Page 4, paragraph 3, or paragraph 2, page 4 anyway. Yes, paragraph 3. I presume that the man, this is your, just so everyone is aware, this is your PERC statement from the 2nd of June 2015, we've looked at this before. Paragraph 3 says, I presumed that the man had been disarmed of the knife during the confrontation with the officers. However, I had not received confirmation of that from anyone at that stage. And you've said that's a presumption on your part. What made you what gave rise to that presumption?
It's only an assumption if it's accurate in terms of what I've told the detective super, appreciating it was a verbal update over the phone, trying to articulate the events from 7 o'clock that morning until I'd phoned them at 7:45 with no written statement or having not really had great time to speak to I hadn't spoke to officers and brief contact with the supervisors that were there.
Can we look, but in the same statement, page 5, paragraph 2, you then go on to say, as I'm taking observations, I had met with DS Davidson and she began to give me a briefing of what had occurred. So this paragraph relates to Hayfield Road. Mm-hmm. She told me that when the cops arrived at the locus, the man came from the area of the bus stop, which I could see was located about 50 to 75 yards away on the north footpath on Hayfield Road. She said he immediately engaged with the cops and was in possession of a knife. Then there was an altercation with him, during which Constable Nicole Short was assaulted. She did not provide detail on the nature of the assault. She also stated that the man was relieved of the knife. However, I didn't ask for clarity on how that happened. She confirmed that he was thereafter restrained by the officers. So we see in that paragraph that you're noting, this is from the June 2015, that it would appear that DS Davidson has told you that the man immediately engaged with the cops and was in possession of a knife. Would you remember if that was the information you were given by DS Davidson?
I don't know, but in given that kind of the brief to Detective Super, the suggestion and inference had been provided by someone. I wouldn't speculate when providing an update, appreciating heavily caveating that when I'm given that initial brief, these details have still to be confirmed. It's purpose to give him, it's not an evidential update, it's just to set the scene for him to understand what we're dealing with, appreciating that the specifics of this the intention it would be established by the investigation.
We've heard evidence that DS Davidson wasn't present when the officers first engaged with Mr. Bile. So, but do you remember if this was the information she was giving you at the time?
I don't recall. And obviously the recency of the statement would support that.
And where it says here, she also stated that the man was relieved of the knife. However, I didn't ask for clarity on how that happened. Do you remember being told that by DS Davidson?
I don't, and obviously for DS Davidson to be told that, I don't know at what hand she was getting that and how she was told of that and informed.
But if this statement is correct, or more accurate certainly, closer to the events, does it appear that at that stage you had made this assumption that Mr. Bile had a knife at the time and was relieved of that during the course of his contact with the police?
That was my understanding there, and obviously if the information passed to Detective Super, which has then been noted by the park, was about certainly that inference of Mr. Bile having the knife and making advances towards officers on their arrival, yes.
And was that the information that you then went on to share when you returned to Kirkcaldy Police Office with other more senior officers?
In general terms, yes.
And in the absence of any accounts from the officers, did you continue to have that understanding, which was based on briefings from other officers?
And every time that I would inform someone, as you say, there would be that caveat of, we don't have a statement, we don't know, the general understanding for the information from the scene is this.
So that information would be perpetuated and shared. Can I ask you about one other thing? Can we go back to the spreadsheet, page 8? I just want to ask you if you remember an airwaves transmission. This was an airwaves transmission at 7:26 and 52 seconds. It's just above halfway down page 8. It's by Acting Police Sergeant Scott Maxwell. It's just for the log. The initial on attendance, this male's attacked PC Short quite violently. As a result, he was sprayed with CS and Pava and battened. There may be a suggestion that he's been battened to the head area. Was that something that you remember hearing, listening to on the day?
No, I don't recall, but I was aware that obviously officer safety equipment had been used in the restraint arrest.
I'm trying to work out whether your understanding of the events and how things had panned out would be more based on briefings you'd received from other officers, such as DS Davidson, or whether it would also be coloured by the content of the airwaves messages that you'd heard or listened to.
I think, in fairness, and as I said yesterday, following my initial attendance, even when I got out of the car, I'm unsure if I had my airwaves, because being on scene, I thought that was best place. I've obviously passed messages and then naturally been on the phone, so I think having attended the messages going back to the control room, I wouldn't be as aware of.
So much more likely that the information you had came from briefings from other officers.
But the discussions at the scene.
Discussions at the
yeah.
scene. Regardless of whether those were first-hand accounts or
Yeah.
second-hand accounts. Thank you. Can I ask you to move on to the first Gold Group meeting, please? So that we've touched on this before. It's 11:30 on the 3rd of May. And if we could perhaps look at the minutes of that. PS 06491. You'll see these are typed up minutes. You've also got your day book, which you took notes.
Yes.
We've taken you through some of those notes. We see there that you were present at that meeting, and it was chaired by ACC Nicholson. And also in attendance were Chief Superintendent McEwen, Detective Chief Superintendent Bowl, Detective Superintendent Campbell, Chief Inspector Shepherd, and somebody from the media, Kate Finlay. The MIT weren't there,
Not at that time, no.
and the PERC weren't there.
That's correct.
And can I confirm that the daybook notes that you have in relation to this meeting, were they taken contemporaneously when you were in the meeting?
Yeah. As I said, I think because of the number and that there wasn't very much next to the kind of agenda item at number 2.
And then I think, as you say, and as you've said earlier, if we go down to agenda item number 2, do we see that the factual update was given by you, Detective Inspector Robson? And that in minutes what you've been doing
Yes.
up till that point in time. Can I ask you to look at your second inquiry statement, please? 212, paragraph 212. I think you've been asked in your inquiry statement about this first Gold Group meeting, and the paragraphs relating to this go from 212 to 226. But looking just at 212 for the moment, there was no suggestion of criminality, so the response officers were part of the overall investigative strategy, and that's why I've noted them as that in my book. Is that your day book?
Yes.
I'd like to ask you about that. We've heard evidence from others that say when you're investigating an unexplained death, it's important to keep an open mind.
Mm-hmm.
There could be various hypotheses or explanations why that person has died. There could be criminal reasons, or there could be medical reasons or something. Would you agree with that?
That's correct.
And for the SIO, it's important to consider all of those possible options. Yes. Can you explain, without having any accounts from the attending officers, how it was that you could say there was no suggestion of criminality on the part of the response officers?
There was no information, so I think even that part of that paragraph should be the overall investigative strategy, specifically witness strategy, because at that time we had classed them as witnesses because there was no other information to suggest any wrongdoing, any kind of active part on the officers that had led to the death of Mr. Rao.
And where could that type of information have come from, if it had existed?
Potentially witnesses at the scene, so again that would have been captured as part of the house to house. So independent witnesses, separate from the police response.
If information, although there was no suggestion of criminality at that time during this first Gold Group meeting, if information had come to light subsequently from a witness statement, for example, would that have automatically triggered a change in status for the officers?
Like any other investigation, a witness until we have information to suggest otherwise.
And then if that information comes to light and the status of the officers changes to suspect, we've heard that other procedures are triggered at that point. But as part of the investigation, that can progress and things can change over the course of time.
Yes.
Now, can I ask you how that might relate to requesting statements from officers? Because it may be the case that if you have a witness and you're interviewing that witness in person, face to face, if they say something incriminating, you can immediately say these triggers will have to, these procedures will have to change because your status may now change to suspect. What's the position with police officers where they are being asked to write effectively operational statements or to give accounts, maybe in writing? They would simply be writing the whole thing out. There's nobody there to stop them and say, hang on, there's new procedures we have to adopt. Can you tell us how that's taken account of when you're dealing with taking accounts from officers?
So again, on a daily basis, we are asking officers for statements. I suppose if we have the confidence that they're in a position to provide their own, there is no suggestion that we suspect them of committed any crime or offence. If they were to choose, and we don't then monitor if they're to provide their own, I suppose on review, if there was something that cast suspicion or introduced something, that then we would have to review that. I suppose it would be on the part of the officer having, from the outset, us clarifying and confirming that they're a witness. It would be their choice if they were to incriminate themselves as part of anything they were involved in.
And if officers did incriminate themselves within a statement, such as an operational statement, that could be used as evidence against them?
On a case-by-case basis, it would be assessed, yes.
Can we go back to the minutes, please, which we looked at a moment ago? So the minutes for the first Gold Group meeting, PS 06491. And I'd like to look at agenda item number 3. And you'll see that this is the investigative process item. It's led by DCS Bowl and Detective Superintendent Campbell. And you'll see as we move down the bullet points there's one that reads CT considerations raised by ACC and to be reviewed by NIB. What are CT considerations?
Counter-terrorism.
And raised by the ACC, is that ACC Nicholson?
It will be, yes.
And what's the NIB?
It's the National Intelligence Bureau, so more the national function of, I would describe about the divisional intelligence offices. This is the national function.
And was there anything at this stage, so this is the 11:30 Gold Group meeting, that would explain why counter-terrorism is being mentioned at this meeting?
No, I think as you say, in the outset on any investigation, we keep an open mind in terms of motives or how incidents have occurred. I think to consider everything is the right thing to do as part of the CT consideration. I think from the ACC's perspective at that time was some form of kind of correlation to other events in the UK at that time and the potential threat level.
I'll come back to that. I'm conscious of the time for the...
15-minute break.
Thank you, I'd forgotten about the time.
Yes, Ms. Graham.
Thank you. We were talking about counter-terrorism, and you said from the ACC's perspective at that time, was there some kind of, some form kind of correlation to other events in the UK and the potential threat level? What was said at that meeting about the connection between these events and counter-terrorism, or possible counter-terrorism?
So that was the first of it being introduced in terms of that term. I had not heard the reference or made a reference or had any thought around this being CT or counter-terrorism related. I think naturally as the kind of strategic oversight that the Assistant Chief Constable would have had, it was something, and again with him having the broader organisational kind of landscape, whether that's something that was his area of business, something he'd been briefed on previously, because he would be privy to these briefs in terms of the threat picture in the UK, that naturally he introduced it as a consideration if this had played a part in the incident.
So the person to speak to about that would be ACC Nicholson, to see what his thought processes
Yeah, I
were.
would imagine, but as he introduced it, it wasn't something that, it was a consideration and he wanted it explored as part of it. So he introduced it as a consideration, and I imagine an associated action to explore that.
Did he explain any specific reasons why he thought it should be explored in these circumstances?
I don't recall, just the overriding factor of considering it as the investigation proceeded.
Was the race of Mr. Bio mentioned as being a consideration?
The race of Mr. Bio was mentioned because that was the factual update, not, I don't think I recall correlating the race with the CT element.
Did Nicholson correlate his race with the CT element?
I'm not too sure.
Was anything said by Nicholson making any connection or drawing an inference of such, like from the race of Mr. Bio and
not as bluntly to
counter-terrorism?
say the male involves black, so is this CT related? Not that direct correlation. I imagine he would have given some context around it, but I can't recall the kind of reasons. But it's not. I mean, we do consider every eventuality, so I suppose he was right to highlight as we progress for this to be a consideration.
Did he mention, as part of this agenda item on counter-terrorism, the fact that Mr. Bio was black, or mention his race, even tangentially?
So from the outset, as a factual update, it would obviously introduced or confirmed that Mr. Bio was black. I don't think he reiterated the fact that when it came down to the CT consideration, is that are we only considering this because he was black? I don't recall that.
So the fact he was black was mentioned at the beginning
From the outset as part of my update in terms
of the meeting, and by you,
yeah.
not repeated by Nicholson in relation to the item that covered CT?
Not that I recall.
From your perspective, was there anything that you were aware of about the particular circumstances of this incident that would have given you cause to consider counter-terrorism?
No.
Did you consider terrorism?
Probably not until it was mentioned as a consideration. But again, we don't. I think that's the rule of thumb, that we don't discount anything, especially in the early stages, until we get information to make that assessment of the principles of any crime and incident.
Thinking back now, what was the first time that day that anyone mentioned terrorism or a possible link to terrorism to you?
With obviously having today and yesterday explaining what I was involved in, that was the first of me being aware of it being introduced.
And you've talked about, you have to think about every eventuality. Was there anything about the circumstances that even gave rise in your mind to terrorism as being one of the eventualities?
No, but the primary focus was establishing a potential motive as to the incident.
Right. Can I ask you to look at your inquiry statement again, please? The second one, 221 and 222. primarily 222. But look, please, first of all, at 221, just so you can see. You've obviously watched some of the first sessions in the public inquiry, and you recognise that officers were asked about the type of incident they were dealing with, and there was mention in the first hearing about the Gold Group meetings. At that time, a number of reported incidents classed as counter-terrorism had occurred in the UK and were well publicised. We didn't know what we had here. It would be wrong to dismiss terrorism. The ACC has raised it, and that element should be reviewed by our National Intelligence Bureau. For any incident, we'd always look for intelligence function to see if there's any links to help build that intelligence picture. The NIB is a national function with links to other police forces and national databases to share information. Where it says here, for any incident, we'd always look for intelligence function to see if there's any links to help build that intelligence picture. Is this for any incident you look for intelligence function with regard to terrorism?
No.
Or connections to do with terrorism?
Just any incident where any crime, offence that we're investigating, we'll always look to build that intelligence picture, and I think that's been referred to asking for intelligence profiles, and we have a function that does that in terms of intelligence officers.
So it's not a specific reference to counter-terrorism intelligence?
Yeah, no, not at all.
And you say for any incident, do you mean genuinely any incident at all? You look for intelligence?
Every matter that the police will deal with, there's an option to look at what information is held on computer or police systems to help give you more information, support information.
In terms of incidents where you look for or consider counter-terrorism, what sort of incidents exist where you would look for counter-terrorism intelligence?
I suppose you wouldn't go looking for the specific intelligence. Those checks would maybe give an indication of the types of intelligence that existed, but appreciating that the National Intelligence Bureau has links to the wider UK systems that I wouldn't get access to or be privy to. So again, I think it was just part of that intelligence picture holistically that the ACC was looking for it to be considered as part of.
So you've talked about your actions, which were to recover intelligence generally. We've seen your action book, Colette Bell, Sheku Bayo, and you've said the witnesses, you would look for that. Was it a change after the first Gold Group meeting where the ACC Nicholson mentioned counter-terrorism? Did things then change after that first Gold Group meeting?
Not really. He was just bringing out specific links that he wanted explored or considered as part of the intelligence profiles that I requested on police systems that are searched. That may have given some form of marker or indication that was CT related. I don't know, but until we embark on those searches, we don't know what information that's held within police and partner agency systems.
So during that first Gold Group meeting, when ACC Nicholson raised counter-terrorism, who was tasked at that point with pursuing that issue?
I think it would be a task to our National Intelligence Bureau. So there would be some form of conduit for that and allocated, whether it was allocated to our divisional intelligence to liaise with the national function.
Who would be responsible for making that contact with the National Intelligence Bureau?
I don't know, because I was unsure of what resource that Detective Superintendent Campbell was provided in support of the Perk investigation. It would be potentially, in part of developing that intelligence cell, there might have been somebody brought in for that, I'm unsure.
Now we know that the counter-terrorism element came under agenda item 3, which was led by Detective Superintendent Campbell. Would he be the best person for us to ask about this, pursuing this line, the counter-terrorism line?
Most likely, because the actions that I've recorded pretty much bring everything up to speed before the Gold Group. It was everything prior to that Gold Group and then the handover to Perk. And I think you'll see some writing on my action book that refers to other actions, so the action book of the MIT perhaps, if they or the action book of Park.
Feel free to look at your action.
I just know in some of the margins, especially in the kind of document summary in the action book, there is writing that's not mine, and it's got next to it A6, A7. So that maybe is another action book will exist, no doubt, that in terms of time and date stamp will pick up where I've left off.
Is there any entry or action within your action book that relates to counter-terrorism?
No.
And did you personally pursue any line of investigation or a strand which related to counter-terrorism? No. And was that any part of your consideration of the investigation into the death of Mr. Bayo?
Not my early actions or considerations, no. Apart from keeping an open mind to any eventuality.
Can I ask you to look at 222 now? It should be on this, just on the screen. It is integral to any incident and the basic principles of any investigation to try and establish a motive. By no means did I immediately think this was a terror incident, nor did I think there was any racial element in it, to it, or have any information that supported this. I saw it as a call to police where somebody was in a public place with a knife. Police attend in response. They are engaged by the male and have used physical restraint to gain control of him. I can see why, if it was terror related, like had to be considered and explored. In the early stages of any investigation, you are in the information gathering phase until you are comfortable you know what you're dealing with. This then allows for motives including terror to be discounted, but it would be remiss to rule anything out from the start until this. And so I think you've already said you weren't ruling out terrorism, but that wasn't a specific part of your...
Never at the forefront of my mind in terms of that early actions.
In line 3 here, you say, nor did I think there was any racial element to it, or have any information that supported this. What sort of information would you have been looking for if you'd been looking for something that supported a racial element?
I'm unsure, obviously, in terms of the kind of line of questioning from the inquiry. I don't know if that sentence then changed from the motive of why Mr. Bayo was in, obviously on Hayfield Road, and the calls that were received, intention behind that, then moving on to potentially did I mean about the role of the actions of the police? I'm unsure. I think I change topics effectively, I think. And I think that goes back to, was there evidence of any kind of racial motive on the part of the police, perhaps?
Well, let's just read the beginning of that then. It is integral to any incident and the basic principles of any investigation to try and establish a motive. Mm-hmm. By no means did I immediately think this was a terror incident, nor did I think there was any racial element to it or have any information that supported this. So when you put that into context, mm-hmm. Do you understand what you mean when you say, nor did I think there was any racial element? Are you thinking about a racial element that
I think
on
I'm
the
going
part
between
of
the
the
two.
officers?
Yeah, I think I'm going between the two in terms of there's nothing to suggest in terms of the actions of Mr. Bayo were terror related. Likewise, there was nothing in the actions of the police that I saw were race related. I think I'm trying to capture there. I'd probably not known the question that would come from the inquiry team.
And just to be clear, this isn't a series of questions that are provided to you by the inquiry team. This is a conversation or a discussion.
That take the form of a question and answer.
Yeah, so they'll ask you questions and you're given freedom to reply. But it's not as if they come to you with a series of 21 questions or 222 questions and ask you each.
There's a lot of questions, but no.
No, that's fine. So can I ask you again, what would you have been looking for as an SIO investigating a sudden death? Mm-hmm. What elements or what evidence would you be looking for if you were wishing to consider whether there was a racial element or a racial motivation?
So perhaps a direct allegation from an independent witness, some information from a source that indicated the actions of the police or anybody were racially motivated,
And that would have come from civilian witnesses, possibly?
and also within potentially allegations from colleagues of officers that may have, in their eyes, acted inappropriately or unlawfully.
And if that information had been available, you would have started considering a racial element.
Definitely.
Were you aware of concerns generally in the UK about black men having passed away after contact with police officers from maybe scenarios, situations down in England, for example?
Not specifically UK, the wider world, yes.
America, perhaps? Was that something that you had in your mind on the 3rd of May, that there may be a racial element? Not
until the link was made in the media, effectively, no.
When was the link made in the media?
I can't recall.
We've seen an entry in D.S. Dursley's daybook which refers to Zaid Saheed, and the word racist appears in his handwriting. Was there anything that you were aware of in relation to contact with Zaid Saheed on the 3rd of May that gave rise to any concerns about racism or racial discrimination being part of
No, I think
the
that
events?
I think that only I was aware of that potentially when following DC Mitchell and Parker's contact with the family, perhaps.
So when you talk about the family, are you talking about the Johnsons?
Yes.
Caddy and Addie Johnson. So after DC Mitchell and DC Parker had delivered the death messages to the Johnsons, were you aware that the issue of potential racism had been raised by them?
Yes. I don't, whether it was directly from the officers or indirectly from other colleagues.
So it could have come through DS Dursley, or it could have come direct from contact with Mitchell and Parker? Yes. What time was that? Do you remember?
I can't recall. Definitely at a point that I was no longer involved in the kind of active investigation. And at a time, obviously, they'd been to see the family, so late afternoon into the early evening.
So what impact did that have on you, that issue having been raised?
I suppose as a, not so much as a police officer, but as a person, human being, the fact that if that was the thoughts of a family against, as I say, it wasn't directly aimed at me, but as the organisation, it does have an impact in terms of how our actions, and I suppose selfishly me, my actions would be perceived in the kind of aftermath of it. So it definitely hit home in terms of the kind of gravity of what we were dealing with.
And that was your feelings as a person, or your personal views. What impact did that have in relation to your status as a police officer, as an inspector in the police service, one who's had long service?
It's appreciating that this has just come following contact with a family that have been told circumstances in terms of their loved one dying. I appreciate emotions run high, things are said in the heat of the moment, so I probably didn't think too much of it at that time.
Why?
We had a lot to be getting on with. We were still in the midst of the investigation and having the role to play. It was, yeah, you can't take things too personally, because again, as it aimed at the organisation, obviously something that an organisation that I'm kind of passionate about. But yeah, as I say, it was a bit of the kind of reality of what was being suggested, but appreciating that, or in my hope that what the fullness of an investigation would confirm or negate.
Did you just say you hoped it would confirm or
well,
negate?
It wasn't that I felt that the right to respond and become defensive, because especially if we're talking about, it goes against keeping that open mind, but the hope that the fullness of an investigation would give the answers and conclusions of any suggestion in terms of motive or actions of the police.
Were you hoping that it would negate that suggestion and the officers would be absolved of any suggestion of racism?
You always do, but if there were circumstances that suggested otherwise, that's not for me to defend.
In relation to your role at that time, you've told us about finding out after the issue was raised by the Johnsons. Initially, you were the SIO. You've talked about Perk coming in roughly about 2ish in the afternoon. You've talked about Detective Superintendent Campbell being a more senior SIO to you. In the afternoon, once you were aware of this suggestion of possible racism, what impact did that have, if any, on your work and the role you were taking at that stage? So this would be by the mid to late afternoon.
It didn't have any impact on my role because I was no longer the decision maker. Any actions and decisions had already occurred. As I say, at that time, the function was more the administrative management of recording our actions, arranging briefing notes in terms of pretty much tried to summarise the events up until my involvement ceased effectively.
Can I ask you about a meeting that you had, an initial meeting with Perk at 2:10 in the afternoon? I think you'll see reference to this at 227. And you'll see it's about a meeting with Perk. I think I had a meeting with Perk at 2:10, and this was part of the second Gold Group meeting. I had to do a bit of scene setting to Perk on what was already said beforehand. Was this your first contact with Perk that day?
Yes.
And you said it was part of the second Gold Group meeting. If we have minutes from that second Gold Group meeting at 14:40, was this just shortly prior to the start of that meeting?
Yeah, I think there was potentially delay in the fact of that meeting kicking off due to just other ongoing matters.
And then I think there might be reference to this in your daybook on page 4. So if we just very briefly go back to that, page 4, and in the middle of that page it should say 14:10, meeting with Perk, is that correct? Keith Harrower, Deputy Investigator. And then as we go down that page, we can see a number of topics or strategies that are noted there. There are asterisks against the next of kin FLO. Tell us about that, why it's asterisked.
I don't know, but again, it's in the same vein as the first Gold Group that I think there was an intent, it was their intent for the first contact with the family, next of kin would be family liaison officer.
Right. And then underneath it says CCTV in van not recording. So by that stage, that line, you realised there was no recording. Yeah. Then it says independent witnesses. Does that say MIT progress, or is it?
Yeah, MIT to progress. I've got in.
MIT to progress. And then underneath it says status witnesses. What's that a reference to?
I think that must be the officers.
And was it your understanding at 2:10 that their status remained that of witnesses?
Yes, and I think obviously my notes are not as extensive there because for the second Gold Group meeting there was a detective sergeant that was doing that on my behalf.
Who was that?
Paula Wanda, I think.
So was this information that was given to you by Perk at that time?
I think that was part of the meeting. I think, like whereas before that I've numbered it, which is then transposed onto the minutes, this was probably just my notes are the pertinent points from the meeting and not exhaustive.
So that's the meeting you had with Perk at 2:10. Information they were giving you was that the police officers were
the meeting I had with Perk informed was the Gold Group effectively. I didn't have a side meeting. I think that maybe the time that I've put down, then there was a delay in the Gold Group meeting start.
So the meeting you had with Perk
was part of the wider Gold. There might have been discussions in terms of introduction, but when I went into that, reiterated the factual or the update, from the first goal group and reiterated at the second, supplemented by anything new, was being within the environment of the second goal group meeting.
So was everybody who was at the Gold Group meeting
that
in the room at that time?
And if you've got the minutes from the second goal group meeting, your list of attendees would be there.
And that was effectively a discussion in front of everyone
Yeah.
about the status of officers being witness.
Yes, I don't think, from my look, that the 14:10 to 14:30 was a 20-minute meeting with Park. With just me, I don't think that was the case. It was the short introduction and then the formal process of the goal group meeting to ensure that and capture the discussion and what was being discussed.
Right, thank you. Let's look at the minutes of the second Gold Group meeting then. PS 07268. And we see there, this is the meeting listed as be taking place at 14:40, and those present included ACC Nicholson, who remained to chair the meeting, and attended by McEwen, Bowl, Campbell, Detective Chief Inspector Houston, Shepherd, yourself, Kate from the media, and then Keith Harrower from PERC and Keith Hardy from MIT, and someone called John Ferguson. Was John Ferguson also from PERC? Or was he from...
It's not a name I'm familiar with, and I don't know if it was potentially PERC he was from.
All right. So this is the first meeting where we see the presence of PERC and MIT.
The first formal meeting, yes.
Had there been previous meetings that you know
I just
of?
more refer to the discussions that maybe Detective Superintendent Campbell's had with PERC.
There may have been contact with them prior to this, but this was the first meeting they
That's
attended.
correct.
And we see item 2, if we go down the page, that there's a factual update, full circumstances of incident relayed to Gold Group by D.I. Robson. And this time you've included details of the call cards, verbal account by Duty Sergeant Scott Maxwell, and actions completed in respect of locus, deceased, officers concerned and significant witnesses. Can you tell me what it means, verbal account by Duty Sergeant Scott Maxwell, please?
And that's, he wasn't there. I think it was, and again that's been noted by somebody else, was me giving, I think we've discussed what I was told at the scene when I've interacted with DS Davison and Sergeant Maxwell.
So again, the update at this stage comes from you,
Yes.
and it's based on information you were given by Sergeant Maxwell and possibly DS Davidson at the scene.
Yes.
And we looked at that earlier before the break.
And my observations as well.
But in relation to the events involving Mr. Bayou, you weren't present when they were
No.
going on, and so your information came second hand
correct.
from other officers. And thank you. I would like to ask you about Zaid Sahid, please. Sorry. Could we look at paragraph 268 of your inquiry statement now? And here you explain that between gold groups between 1440 and 2015, you took the crime scene manager out from PERC and showed him the locus. It was over to him effectively. It was handed over to PERC by that stage. There was a police presence there for days and weeks after. So you've told us about the gold group meeting at 1440. There was another one scheduled for 8:15 that evening. And between that period, you took the crime scene manager from PERC to the locus. Was that the point where effectively the handover was complete from you, of your role of SIO to PERC?
Yeah, I think obviously the role of SIO had been handed over in the first gold group meeting to Detective Superintendent Campbell. That was more just to help kind of set the scene in terms of the Park crime scene manager who'd been allocated. So it's more just to take him up and familiar with the surroundings, and again just relay the information I had to hand at that time.
So after you handed over the formal SIO role to Detective Superintendent Campbell at the first PERC meeting, and up until this point where PERC have taken over responsibility, what was your role between the first Gold Group meeting and the second Gold Group meeting when PERC arrived?
So the first Gold Group meeting was doing the minutes or summary of that meeting to again help inform the updates and briefing for PERC and other senior management, and I started the action because, well, with that first entry, if you recall, at 2 o'clock in terms of the call cards.
And so was that more of an administrative role at that stage?
With the exception of going out with the crime scene manager for PERC, it was my role throughout the rest of that day before I terminated duty was purely administrative.
And then administrative plus the visit to the locus with PERC. And then what time did your responsibilities come to an end? What time did you end your duty that day?
Around about midnight, I think.
Midnight. And so until midnight, did your duties remain administrative?
Yes.
Did you also continue to be involved with other, you've told us that you were duty SIO for the Fife Division that day. Did your other duties continue throughout the day, or did you focus mainly on this investigation with Mr. Bio?
Basically, because this incident had consumed us, there was provisions put in place for another SIO separately. Again, I think I'd explained yesterday about policing needed to continue in terms of both from a uniform perspective and from crime management SIO oversight. So I don't recall what was put in place, but there would have been a provision of staff to cover day business for other ongoing matters.
When did that happen?
More or less the early afternoon. I don't recall who it was. I think there was phone calls made to existing SIOs if they could effectively come onto duty and perform that function. But I didn't get involved in any other business from the outset effectively. So if there was ongoing matters elsewhere, they were dealt with by other staff.
You'll see that in this part of the statement you come on to be asked questions about Zahid Saheed. And I'd like to look first of all at paragraph 273. I have been referred to my statement, this PERC statement. I have since been asked to provide an additional statement owing to a data audit that has been carried out by the PERC, which provides that on the 3rd of May 2015, I accessed at 16:38 and 16:42 hours the same date during which time I have opened, which listed the details of Mohammed Saeed Saheed. Just to put this into context, as I understand it, PERC at a later stage came back to you and asked you for the statement, which was PERC 00224. Don't need to go to it at the moment, but I asked you about that yesterday when we started. That was in November of 2015, 24th of November. And they asked you to explain why they'd carried out a data audit and asked you to explain why some searches or information had been gathered in regarding Zahid Saheed. And the second part of that paragraph there says, owing to the circumstances and his link to Sheku Bio on the day of the incident, I can confirm that I accessed police systems in order to ascertain the correct nominal details and spelling of Saeed to enable me to accurately brief senior management and complete various documents, including the minutes of an initial Gold Group meeting. So was this part of your administrative duties at that time? Why did you need to ascertain the correct nominal details and spelling?
I think it's probably
Saeed Saheed?
proven even in my daybook in terms of how I've attempted to spell it, and it is just to ensure accuracy. So I didn't recall until I was prompted, but we obviously have individual logins for our police systems, so it is quite plausible that I will have carried out that search. What would be interesting is other searches around about that time period as well, always just trying to provide some accuracy of the information.
Did you carry out searches in relation to Martin Dick? His name is spelt with a Y.
I don't recall, but it is definitely plausible that I could have searched every nominal that was linked on the names in the action book. Again, just checks and balances to the right date of birth, the right home address, spelling. Again, just to help with the accuracy of the information that I was putting my name to.
So when PERC came back to you and said they'd done a data audit and they'd recognised that you'd done these searches 1638 to 1642, did they mention Martin Dick to you?
I don't recall. As you say, this was facilitated through professional standards at the time, who'd emailed asking for that addendum statement, which I provided. So it's very plausible, and I suppose I would have, whether I should have asked a full audit to demonstrate my full access that day, but also in the environment while our officers present assisting, I may have retrieved that from somewhere else or had someone else carry out the check just to confirm the details.
You hadn't included this in your original statement or your PERC statement?
No.
Was there a reason that you left that out?
An oversight in the fact that whether by covering it by administrative duties, that would have included checks on computers.
And was there any similar search done on Kirsty MacLeod's name? MacLeod spelled M-A-C or as it is M-C?
Not by me, potentially officers that were involved. Sometimes we'll have to, if we've got a name and we don't know their contact details, we have to search systems to identify an address or a phone number.
Can I ask you if you had any subsequent involvement with the flows?
I never knew who the flow was or who was deployed.
Did you have any hand in making arrangements to link Mitchell and Parker and to arrange a briefing by them with flows? No. That was nothing to do with you?
No, and I think by that time, I think it's been articulated that the SIO, Detective Superintendent Campbell, was more or less directly coordinating that with DS Dursley.
Right. And can I ask you, did you have any knowledge at all about a discussion regarding repatriation of the body of Mr. Bayo?
No.
To Sierra Leone?
No.
Can I ask you to look at paragraph 239, please? And this says, repatriation of Sheku Bayo's body wasn't discussed. This is part of the cultural considerations. Muslims would be desired to be buried within a time frame. The body being released to the family wasn't part of the discussion. It was COPFS who had primacy for death investigations. Can I just ask you a little bit more about that? Was there discussion at any of the Gold Group meetings about Mr. Bayo's body being repatriated?
No.
Was there any mention of Mr. Bayo's body being returned to Sierra Leone?
No, and I couldn't see how there would be, because by that, the two Gold Group meetings, I don't think we'd had that engagement with the family, so how would we know that detail or that request?
You say this is part of the cultural considerations. What do you mean by that?
I think it's part of the question and answer conversational structure to the inquiry statement was probably add a bit of context of why that would come up, and as part of any death investigation through consultation liaison with family, the release of the body and subsequent arrangements would be discussed. I know, having been involved in deaths where saying religion plays a part, but the religious that own to that religion, there might be specific requests and asks in terms of the treatment and release.
So this is something that you've come across in other
yeah, I was just trying to say
cases.
that it wasn't discussed, but I can understand why it would be discussed, but not at that time.
And that was not part of any of your involved. You weren't involved in any of that. And then can I finally just check with you, there was a third Gold Group meeting at 8:20, hours,
yes.
8:15 in the evening. I think you were also present at that. Let's look at the minutes of that. PS 03139. And I think you talk about this at paragraph 255. So these are the Gold Group minutes from the 8:15 in the evening. And again, you appear to be present along with all the other senior officers we've mentioned before, along with Perk and Mitt. And if we can just go down that page. I think you've said in your inquiry statement you played, keep going please, you played no significant part in this meeting. That stop there please. And we see that actually it was Detective Superintendent Campbell who gave both the factual update and dealt with the investigative process at number 3 with Leslie Bow.
Yes.
And then can you go to the very bottom please? Does it say that the next meeting would be 1100 hours the following day?
Yes.
Did you have any involvement the following day?
No.
Were you involved at any time after actually the 3rd of May 2015 in these matters?
So again, the next day starting duty was more or less completing the administrative element, which resulted in my statement, and then with the action book going to the MIT as its time and date stamped on the action.
Earlier this afternoon we looked at your action book, we looked at the final entry, and that recorded at 12:20 I think, on the 4th, you handing over the action book.
Yes.
At that time. And was that the end of your administrative tasks to do with that? Thank you. Can I ask you to look at paragraph 281 of your inquiry statement, please? This is the second inquiry statement. Thank you. Sheku Bayo's race was a factor for us in terms of our approach to his family, but in my view not a factor in the incident itself. It played out externally in the media in the days after. Nothing was different in my actions of that day owing to race. My considerations were different. In terms of cultural issues, we have to consider every bespoke approach to incidents. Witnesses, suspects and victims should be considered in terms of equality and diversity. Race is a factor, but only in considering our approach. It's been portrayed publicly for a number of years in terms of documentaries, etc. The police have not, until the police inquiry, responded for legal reasons or whatever. I'd like to go over some of the content of this paragraph. You've said that Sheku Bayo's race was a factor for us in terms of our approach to his family, but in my view not a factor in the incident itself. Could you explain to the Chair, how was his race a factor in terms of your approach to his family?
So again, that the 281 came at the end of the second statement, which was noted in the two periods at the tail end of last year, and I think the conversation and the questions around that was specifically, do you think race played a factor in the death? And I said no. Did race play a factor in the investigation? I said yes, given the fact that Mr. Bayo was black, to understand, and I think I've got it in my daybook in terms of the cultural considerations. I think I've got issues in my daybook in terms of how we approach any family, because we have to tailor that approach, taking into considerations any form of kind of reasonable adjustments round about the race in this instance.
So let's look at your daybook first of all, PS 18495. I think if we look at page 2, you did have a reference to cultural issues and a question mark there.
Number
There
8,
it's
yeah.
just that's it, just at the bottom there. So this is item 8 of your notes on the 11:30 Gold Group meeting, and you've got cultural issues question mark. So what was discussed at the Gold Group meeting about culture issues?
So cultural issues, not issues with the culture, would be more about the considerations in terms of how we tailor our approach to any witness, family, victim. Is there anything around the kind of any reasonable adjustments needed to make around the protected characteristics? And this time it would be race, religion. I suppose we didn't know that until we went. So in other situations, do they need an interpreter? What other form of support does the person need for us to best deliver that service to them. So
So-
it's part of that, again, information gathering about the profile of Mr. Bahou's family in terms of how we can best deliver a service.
So, can you give us some examples? You mentioned an interpreter, but give us some examples of how you would tailor the approach where the victim has been black.
It was more the needs of them, as I say, whether it was the interpreter, and I think I'd said as part of the potential religious considerations with regards to post-mortem. Again, I know, and I didn't know at that time in terms of Mr. Bahawi being Muslim, that sometimes the family are against post-mortems. Sometimes there's a wish to have the body repatriate within a certain amount of time and for a funeral to take place. So again, it was the question mark was, what do we need to consider as part of our approach? Obviously, I wasn't then involved in that. But again, just trying to do the groundwork to tailor and provide a bespoke service, appreciating the needs of everybody is different.
And so, in providing that tailored or bespoke service, are you very much led by the individual families?
Yeah, we might not know that until, again, from that information gathering and intelligence, we might get a better understanding, but sometimes we won't know until we make that direct contact. And as part of that, we would ask them in terms of what reasonable adjustments, provisions they would to best support or provide a service to them.
And is that something that you as SIO would be involved in? Creating a tailored or bespoke?
So yes, so any form of strategy, victim, witness, suspect, accused as well, what would they need in terms of for us to go through some form of legal process?
And so what steps did you take when you were SIO to provide that tailored or bespoke service to Mr. Bio's family?
So I didn't get the opportunity because that then transferred over and was not undertaken by me.
And who was it transferred to?
So the Detective Superintendent Campbell, and then appreciating the actions that was coordinated through DS Dursley.
And in your mind, how do you define family? How would you have defined Mr. Bio's family? What does that mean to you, family?
So just the full wraparound, but again, so we'd had details of the sister in terms of next of kin. I suppose that would be the first port of call to then understand the kind of dynamics in the family setup to how we can best support them collectively.
Only the sister? Or was there anyone else that you were aware of?
That was the only details we had. And I think through conversation, the goal group understood that Chief Superintendent Gary McEwen knew the sister's husband, I recall.
We've heard evidence about that. What about Colette Bell? Did you count her as family?
Yeah, part is that. In terms of family liaison, she would be considered in that full wraparound.
Was Mr. Bio's race a factor in terms of your approach to Colette Bell?
Not Mr. Bio. Again, Colette could have had any protected characteristics or needs that needed to tailor approach to her. I suppose she may have helped, I suppose, in terms of information, in terms of how we supported the family.
So would your tailoring or bespoke service only relate to someone with protected characteristics?
The needs, any needs, we would try to accommodate any needs of any individual that we would encounter or make contact with, again, for them, to assist them in terms of whatever procedure, process we needed to carry out.
When you talk about family in a wider sense, would that include his friends?
Yeah, if he had that close friends so close that he considers a family, yeah, we wouldn't discount anything. And again, it would be led and done in conjunction with the family.
Would that include people such as Zaid Saheed or his family?
Potentially with this, given obviously his direct link, and that extends to all the witnesses as well.
Martin Dick and Kirsty MacLeod?
As part of the adjustments and considerations to how anybody we encounter.
Can I ask you to look, please, at paragraph 122 of your first inquiry statement, which is SPPI 133. So So it's paragraph 122. Can we just go up the page slightly? This is the issue you were asked about the media. I think you may at some point have been asked if you knew anything about how the media had got hold of information that a female officer had been stabbed, and I think in your statement somewhere you do mention that you knew nothing about that. But if I can look at paragraph 122, please. It says, I have seen the views of the family, which are important, but I suppose they are very subjective. It's just what they've read in the media, and I know they've been supported by legal representation as well. The documentaries in that I've pretty much done my best to avoid, because again, it is pretty drama sensationalised, to be honest, and also just the way it had potentially been portrayed. There were agendas in terms of suggesting the race element, etc. I just knew it didn't show the full picture. I'd like to ask you about this. You say you've seen the views of the family. Presumably you've seen things on social media or in the newspapers and that sort of thing.
Yeah, or on behalf of the family.
Right. And you say you suppose they're very subjective. What do you mean by that?
It's their view, and you've got to respect anybody's view. I suppose it's then, is there information or evidence to support that? And what I was getting is that this was the kind of platform for that to be either supported or potentially negated.
We've heard evidence that some of the views held by the family are quite critical of the police. When you say you suppose they're very subjective, do you feel resistant towards views that are expressed that are critical of the police?
Absolutely not, because again, some have proven to be founded.
And you mentioned that they've been supported by legal representation. Why is it you've raised that?
I think it's because I've heard the family speak, but also I know that they're represented as well.
Are you making any comment about the fact that they've been represented legally by a lawyer?
No, it was just an observation, and rightly so.
The documentaries, you've done your best to avoid them. It's pretty drama sensationalised, to be honest. Have you watched these documentaries?
I think I watched one, potentially.
Why do you say they're drama sensationalised?
I think, well, in documentary, in terms of how it was potentially produced, again, just given, I'm not saying one-dimensional, but it was obviously void of any police input because there wasn't the opportunity. So I think that's where, and the frustration wasn't me thinking this is all inaccurate. It was just the fact that they weren't getting the full picture, again, to allow people to make an assessment. Other people's opinion didn't matter, but again, it was more, again, just to give that full holistic picture of what took place on that day.
Has it concerned you, some of the information that's coming out through the media?
More so from the personal element relating to the officers, I think, and that's where I talk about agendas. I don't talk about agendas about race, etc., because again, this is the platform for that to be the evidence given to make that assessment, but more some of the headlines around the officers' private lives. That's where I kind of really felt for them.
Right. What was it you felt?
I just felt they were doing a job on that day as the role of police officers to the best of their ability. Again, their actions are there to be scrutinised like us all, but how their home and private lives were playing out in the public domain, potentially around matters that weren't linked or had any bearing on the actual events of that day, and how that would impact on them personally.
Do you feel quite defensive towards, protective of Police Scotland and some of the officers in it because of the way they're portrayed in the media?
It's not about being defensive or protective, it's just that, again, with that welfare in mind, how this is, until this public inquiry has started, there wasn't an opportunity for them to respond effectively.
And what is it that stops the officers responding?
Again, in terms of we talk about the legal representation for the family, and rightly so, the officers would be afforded that as well in terms of the legal processes. I'm unsure in terms of any kind of restrictions to that.
The words there that you've used in the final sentence, there was agendas in terms of suggesting the race element. Explain what you meant by that, using the word agendas.
No, it was portrayed that race did play a part in the death. Obviously, I was of the view, for the information I had, that I didn't see that race did play a part. But again, that was my view for the information that I had to hand at the time. And
do you accept that the investigation has continued since then and more information has come to light, that even your understanding of the position on the 3rd of May could be different?
Yeah.
And that was only your personal view.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you say there was agendas in terms of suggesting the race element, was this also a reference to the family raising the issue of race as a possible motive on the 3rd of May? You've talked a moment ago about the Johnsons.
Yeah, so I knew there was that was obviously introduced by the family for when the officers returned. And again, I don't even know if the fact that what's been portrayed is accurate from the family's perspective, or if that's something that the media have generated in terms of keeping this in the public domain. I don't know.
Do you accept that the word agendas has quite negative connotations?
Yeah, I do, and I would probably reflect on that. It was more, it seemed to be the sole motive and element was race, where I think, as I've tried to portray, is that we should keep an open mind to being inclusive or considering every eventuality as opposed to exclusive to one.
Mm. And when you say you would reflect on that, if you reflect on that right now, do you think that maybe that's a word that is quite a negative?
Yeah, no, I agree. And
would you like that word to be changed effectively?
It was that my initial statement.
This is your initial statement to the inquiry.
Yeah, it's not how I intended it to come across as.
Right. Thank you. I'm conscious of the time.
Yes, shall we stop there? So we'll continue with your evidence tomorrow morning, Chief Inspector, 10 o'clock.